Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Let's get started with the next session. Our first speaker of this session is Bill Howe from University of Washington. Go ahead.
So my claim is that the microphone is on. Does it sound like it is? Okay. So talk to you about a project that I did with a research programmer named Garrett Cole. We also have a UI design development team there on the left and some students and faculty in computer science on some of the research projects that are related to this. But mostly I'm just going to be talking about the basic system that is not necessarily computer science research. This work is funded by Gordon Betty Moore Foundation and Microsoft Research. And I work at the other eScience Institute. We have a logo here. Here's the URL. If you type in eScience Institute with or without the hyphen in Bing, we are the first link. And you can do the same thing in Google. Okay. So the context here is that there's a lot of talk about big science and large data in science, but there's the long tail of science, right? There's this article in 2004 from Wired that tried to describe the complement of big science, but they didn't want to say small science because that's sort of disparaging, so they sort of coined this term, the long tail, which is to describe the large number of small labs and individual researchers that collectively are producing the bulk of scientific output, but don't necessarily have the IT infrastructure to cope with the growing data sizes, right? So megabytes 3 years ago are becoming gigabytes because you have sort of hundreds of spreadsheets instead of one, and each one has 3 orders of magnitude more rows in it, and so on. And so that's sort of the context of the area that we're doing some of this work. Okay. And so yeah, the long tail is getting fatter over time. All right, so the problem is this. We pose this question to various labs that we work with. How much time do you spend, quote, handling data as opposed to, quote, doing science? And we didn't define these terms, and we didn't ask them to define these terms. We just sort of asked them what they thought about this. And the only real distinguishing point we're trying to make is that, that handling data that does not help you do your science as opposed to handling data that's actually appropriate. What's the overhead? What's the wasted time spent? So what do you think the most common answer was? Any guesses? All right, so I admit this is a small sample size. It's not a rigorous study. We want to put a survey into this. But the answer we came back was 90%. This is a staggering number, right? This is taxpayer money that goes to NSF to come back to go to a postdoc and a graduate student that spend 90% of their time, in their own words, handling data as opposed to doing science, right? Now, the people that didn't say 90%, the people that said something with a little bit more reasonable, like 30% or 40%, what do you think all those people had in common? PIs. They have people working for them, right? So even those PIs who I would have thought spent 0% of their time handling data, right, still say they spend 30%. Meanwhile, they're also asking questions of their postdoc and graduate students to go fetch them answers to data and bring it back. Okay, so there's an enormous amount of overhead here in messing with data. So let me give you an example of the kind of scenario in which this problem manifests. So environmental metagenomics, if you're not familiar, the term metagenomics refers to study of entire populations as opposed to individual organisms. And so what you might do something like this. You take samples from the environment under various conditions and different salinities and different temperatures across the diurnal cycle, across tidal cycles, at different depths, and so on. And you try to characterize in terms of two questions. Who's there and what are they doing, right? So what organisms are present in the sample and what genes are being expressed, right? So the DNA and the RNA. And so you'll take these samples and you'll sequence them, and then you'll do quite a bit of processing on the sequences, and then you'll do some blast queries against various public databases to characterize what sort of organisms are present or what proteins are present too. In each one of these steps, you have this residual data that comes out. You have measurements and metadata from the samples, and you have metadata from the sequencing as well as the sequences themselves, as well as all sorts of intermediate results, and then you have the search results. And the science you want to do is not about running this workflow, right? So workflow systems are fantastic, and in fact, they don't use a workflow system, but they could, and they would get all the benefits. But they do have a pipeline that they built that they're happy with to generate this. But that's not the solution to this problem, right? That's just the way you generate the data is to run the workflow. But when you run this thing 1,000 times or 100 times, you end up with all sorts of residual data, and then you ask your science questions over that residual data. Okay, so our key hypothesis here is that all of this residual data has a tabular structure, or most of it, and further that these science questions that people want to ask are expressible in SQL. And so we built a system to test these two hypotheses. So I'm going to give you a quick demo first, and then we'll talk more about the motivation. Oops. Ignore my email. And I don't know how to see. Didn't account for the resolution change, actually. So you can log in with, we're connected with Shibboleth, and so you can log in with a particular UW Net ID if you're at University of Washington. You can also log in with your Google ID. This is available on the web. You can try it out. You might break it because it's sort of new, but it should work. And that took 2 clicks last time, so we'll see if it does again. So I'm going to log in here. And we're sort of responsive to users, so if people want other kinds of ways to log in, we might provide that. But the basic idea here is that you can upload your data as is without sort of any kind of massaging into a particular schema or pre-cleaning or anything. We don't care about your types. It can all just be text. We don't care about any of it. And at this point, it looks a little bit like other systems out there like Socrata, which is used by Seattle.data.gov, or Google Fusion Tables, or something else. But the key idea that we're trying to explore is that what if we didn't feel the need to hide the SQL from people, right? What if we allowed people to sort of exercise the full expressiveness of SQL? And so you see things like, whoops, let me give you one different example, please. It's a little bit pokey with the internet connection. Okay, so all these examples were either uploaded by scientists. Some of these are uploaded data. Some of these are queries that they wrote, which are derived data sets. And most of these are written by the users. A few of these were written by us as examples to try to explain to them or try to show them how to write certain kinds of idioms. And the key finding here is that by just doing this, by just providing them a core set of examples, they're able to bootstrap themselves and start writing SQL themselves, even with no training. There's people that aren't even programmers that are writing SQL statements, so they're happy to do this. And let me just give you a quick example of the kind of things you can do. This is one of my favorite examples because it sort of exercises the expressiveness of SQL. So this was a literal English question that was given to us, where they said, I don't know how to express this. Can you help me? I want to find all the tiger fam IDs, which represent essentially proteins, that are missing from at least one of these 3 samples, these 3 data sets, right? So how do you express this in SQL? Well, there's a couple of ways to do it, but it's actually pretty elegant, right? Union together all 3 samples, and then subtract out their intersection. And what you're left with is all the individual proteins that are not present in at least one of them. And I'm not trying to go into too much detail here. I just want to point out that the set-oriented language that SQL provides is a very natural fit for some of these questions that they're already asking. So we didn't sort of manufacture examples that fit SQL. They're providing them to us, and they seem to work pretty well. Okay. And so this is 9 lines of code for something that's I claim would be more complex if you did it in a sort of, say, a scripting language. Okay, so for each one of these things, you can edit the query, and the resolution is going to get me in a little bit of trouble here, so I'll probably skip that. But you can edit it, and you can derive new data sets, and you can do all the things you might want to do with queries. And so the idea here is sort of like imagine my grid with workflows. You can sort of do everything you can do with a workflow, you can do with a query, right? So everything you do with a YouTube video, you can do with a query, right? You can comment on it, you can share it, you can rate it, and so on. All right. That's the basic idea. So let me go back to the problem a little bit here. So what we mean by ad hoc research data is things like this. It might be spreadsheets, it might be ASCII files, it might be FASTA formats, and we don't really want to care about what format the data is in. And so we do a combination of some writing of parsers that can understand these various formats, and we also have a few advanced tricks that I won't have time to get into that can automatically infer the structure of files that's based on other people's research, Kathleen Fisher from AT&T in particular. Okay, so what are the things people want to do with these data sets? Well, what we see in practice is that these are two blast hit result tables, right? So the first column is the query sequence, or an identifier for a query sequence, and the rest, if you're familiar with BLAST, represent various results from the similarity scoring. The third column there is the COG hit. So COG is clusters of orthologous groups. It's a public database, and this represents the taxonomic category that this hit corresponds to. And so what we see people doing is taking two sets of these samples and sorting, say in Excel, on COG hit, and then manually copying and pasting matching identifiers from one spreadsheet to another and lining them up, right? So what is that operation for people that are familiar with databases? It's a join, right? So they're manually implementing joins via copy and paste. And 3 years ago or 5 years ago, this wasn't that big a deal, right? Because there was only sort of working with a few spreadsheets at a time. But it doesn't scale. You can't hire the number of graduate students it requires to sort of run all your joins this way. And so this is trivial to express in SQL. And so this is the key idea, that we want to just find a platform that can deliver this kind of expressiveness to scientists. Okay, and sometimes it's not always that simple. You might have to go out on the web and look for sort of crosswalks between different identifiers and so on and so forth, but essentially it's just joins. You might have to do 9 of them instead of 1 of them, but it's all just joins. Okay, so there's other examples. You find cases where you have to use some of the fancy functions that, say, SQL Server provides, where you can test if something is a date. You have group by queries and so on, but it's all pretty expressible. And we weren't exactly expecting this, right? We didn't necessarily assume that everything could be expressed in SQL, but it turns out to be the case. We're having trouble finding examples that can't be expressed fairly simply. All right, I already talked about that. So let me digress a little bit about relational databases. So why are they even here? Why are they so successful? Well, pre-relational, if your data organization on disk changed, all your queries broke, right? Your applications broke, and everything had to be rewritten. Okay, and so COD's observation, you worked at IBM and you went around to all the IBM's customers that use your database products and figured out that essentially everybody's doing about 6 different things with tables. And if you get those 6 different things right, you can separate the physical representation from the logical query, and all sorts of great things ensue. And so the key idea is that the programs that manipulate all this tabular data exhibit an algebraic structure that allow you to sort of query logically and let the system translate that into a physical implementation. Okay. So we called this term data independence, and there's 2 types. There's physical data independence, which is no longer manipulating files, but actually talking about relational tables. But there's also logical data independence, and this is a feature in every single relational database out there, but is wildly underused, especially in science, which is the ability to create views, right? You can write a query and save it, and the original structure of the data does not have to be the structure you actually query. So is this obvious to everybody? Okay, fantastic. Sometimes it's not. All right, so there's an algebra of tables. I talked about that. Algebraic optimization. Hey, does everybody know what I mean when I say algebraic optimization? Everybody? Okay, good. I'm going to skip that then. So you'd be surprised. So the summary here is that what's provided by relational database, or at least by the language, by the logical model in relational database, is a lot of nice things, right? There's an intuitive data model. Everything's just tables. You can already express a lot of data cleaning, filtering, joins, aggregation, and so on. There's this notion of logical data independence. You have a declarative query language and algebraic optimization. It scales well. You know, SQL is the most successful parallel language ever, right? Anybody not buy that? What? Agreed. Okay. And there's proven results. So what's the point of all this? Well, databases, despite all these great benefits that we all sort of agree are there, they're underused in the long tail. Why? Right? So the conventional wisdom is, well, the reason is that scientists won't write SQL. We don't believe this. And you can look at, you don't have to believe us, you can look at the results from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and Life Under Your Feet and several things that we're also doing. Instead, we implicate the upfront cost of delivering these things. And it's not just installation and configuration, although that's part of it. It's also this onerous task of schema design, right? You have to sit down with them and have meetings about and draw ER diagrams, and they don't care about any of that crap, right? They just want to get started with their data. Okay, so we ask what kind of platform can deliver the benefits without all this other overhead. And that's what the demo that I showed you. It's basically in the cloud. We run it on SQL Azure. I'll explain what this is in a second. It's a Windows Azure app. We have a nice RESTful interface. We have several different client applications. The one I showed you is sort of the flagship application that's currently hosted on EC2. We actually have 2 backends right now, one in SQL Azure and one as a SQL Server database running on EC2. This pipeline from here through to here is colossally stupid. Can you see why? So data that gets uploaded to here is running on EC2. There's some money to inbound data transfer. Then it goes to Azure, which is some inbound data transfer. Then it goes back to EC2, which is some inbound data transfer. Then it comes back out and so forth. So we're sort of working that out. However, I have to say that this combination of things was remarkably easy to set up and get running on. So even though it's probably not a long-term solution, it was fantastic as a development solution. So we're sort of standardizing on SQL Azure, and we're moving the web server onto a hosted platform there at UW, so we don't have to pay anything. Okay. So how do we use this thing? Well, when we engage with a new lab, we do this sort of mini version of the 20 questions methodology, right? We say, look, give us your data and give us 20 questions in English that you want to ask about it. And then we upload it and we translate some of the initial queries and then post them into SQL Share. And they take those and tweak them and adjust them and drive their own queries. And this simple model has been remarkably successful. Again, people that don't know SQL or don't program even are able to use this kind of stuff. Okay. Other use cases for this thing, we're seeing, one lab is using it sort of as a poor man's laboratory information management systems, right? They track all their status of all their samples in various pipelines in spreadsheets, but they want to ask holistic queries, and that's difficult, right? They want to ask queries across, say, 7 different spreadsheets that different people are editing all the time. So just upload all these things and go ahead and ask your question. And when you want to when things change, upload it again, and it'll automatically replace the old version, right? Another thing people are doing is, well, they know they want a real database design. They want to go through. They're willing to actually go through the sort of conventional process of designing a schema and so forth, but they're not quite, ready yet. They don't know quite what the schema should look like. And so this is good as a pilot project, right? Start throwing your data into this thing. Start writing queries to understand what kind of structures you have in order to inform the more heavyweight process later down the road. And that was sort of something we didn't expect, but turns out to be useful. You can use this as a collaborative query management system, which is a paper from CIDR 2009 about the benefits of being able to sort of write queries together as opposed to independently. And so that's a lot of the sharing. And I mentioned that. Credit to Alex Zalay, who has this notion of a data instrument, right? So they'll put their data into SQL Share and use it sort of as a microscope on the data temporarily, and then ignore it or throw it out, or they can delete it later, right? It's just sort of a temporary tool for helping you to understand what's going on, and that's kind of interesting too. So it doesn't have to be a production system that hosts an app or anything else. And then the last example here that I like a lot is an extension for citizen science, right? So most of the work in citizen science is what I've been calling sort of stage 1, which is the democratization of data collection, right? Getting people with their cell phones to go out and collect data for you, and then you aggregate it later. But the only people who are willing to do or are able to do the analysis on that data are the, quote, real scientists. But stage 2 would be democratize the data analysis as well. And this kind of tool can do that, I think, by saying, anyone's allowed to ask any question they want. You can derive your own query from existing queries and so forth. Okay, and you have the full power of SQL. You have exactly the same interface that the scientists had. You don't have to go, you don't have a dumbed down interface to it. Okay. Usage is about 6 months old, but we haven't advertised it at all yet. How am I doing on time?
Another 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I'm fine. So it's about 6 months old. There's 4 different labs around UW campus, and again, we haven't advertised yet. We have a sort of an official release and so forth coming out soon. There's 50 unique users. We have 600 tables uploaded, 200 saved queries views, only about a tenth of which we wrote, and there's about 16 gigabytes of data, and that's sort of important. This isn't sort of a large-scale system, right? This is for sort of collecting your spreadsheets together. So we haven't talked too much about the scalability story here yet, although a relational database, you could do a lot worse for a scalable solution. All right, so I want to talk about a little bit before I go about why this is interesting, because it may seem like, well, duh, right? You put a database, put it in the cloud, let people put their data up there and start to query it. Well, that process I described, bootstrapping the scientists to help them sort of self-serve in this system, has us in the loop, right? We're helping them write the first set of queries, and we're helping them upload their data and so on. So some of the research projects we have are in order to try to get us out of the loop and just otherwise streamline this process. And I think there's some really interesting problems to work on. So one is a very old problem, which is English to SQL, right? So this has been heavily studied in the database community. The twist that we think we have on it, and Luke Zettelmoyer is a CSE faculty who's an expert in this problem, is that since we're not afraid to show the SQL, it's okay to fail. It's okay to not get it just right. So with things like Ask Jeeves had a very difficult task. You had to write an English query and get back the exact results that the user expected, right? We can get part of the results. We can say, you know what, it looks like that phrase in your English description matches this predicate in a query, but we don't understand what everything else is. And that still might be useful as a way to bootstrap people, or as a way to get people started writing SQL. Okay, so we're exploring that. There's a project that actually was underway before I even got to UW, which is SQL autocomplete, right? So if you take a big query log and you carve it up into snippets, when people start typing their SQL, you can say, people that started typing SQL in the way you just did typically followed it with these other snippets as well. And so you can help them kind of autocomplete their SQL based on what other people have already queried. That's kind of an interesting capability to put into a system like this to help people bootstrap. This one I like a lot. I'm interested in quite a bit right now, which is this initial set of 20 queries. What if you don't have a query log already? You've just uploaded the data right now, and I'm looking at a blinking cursor, right? So what I claim you can do, what we're sort of exploring, is look at the distribution of data in the tables itself, and derive, quote, good queries directly from that. You can look at when two tables make sense to join together. You can look at when a table makes sense to do a group by query on, right? And so we're trying to figure out what this set of heuristics are, and maybe do a little machine learning on things that have come before, for example, SDSS, in order to figure out a good set of starter queries automatically from the data they upload. And I think that's pretty cool. The other thing you might want is tables are great. You can write queries and get back answers, but you really want visualization or something more usable. And so we're looking at how to sort of automatically derive dashboards from this stuff too. You upload your data and you automatically get back some windows exposing various properties of it. And then finally, there's been a lot of work on query recommendation services, but there's been less so on personalized. And so we're looking a little bit more at, since we have access to, for example, UW Net IDs, we actually know a little bit about the person. Can we sort of steer them towards astronomy queries if they're an astronomer and things like that? Okay. So that's it. Again, there's a URL. You can actually try to use this thing. And I don't know if there's anybody in the room here. It might be among friends, but if you're a fan of the NoSQL movement, ask me about it. And I have a slide for you. All right. That's it.
Thanks, Bill. Questions?
All right.
We're wanting to record it, so let me just hand. Who's next? Jeff.
Too small to read? I don't know. So it says, I won't read the whole thing out loud, but so how do I query the database? It's not a database. It's a key value store. Okay, it's not a database. How do I query it? You write a distributed map reduce function in Erlang. Did you just tell me to go? I believe I did, Bob. Anyway, so the point is, I think it's great. I think there's room for it in the ecosystem, but I think SQL is not the problem. Things like overuse of MySQL was the problem, right? Oh, sorry.
Okay. So one of the things I've found in sort of teaching myself SQL is that the GUI interface in SQL Server, is pretty good, and it's a way of kind of at least getting started with learning how to design queries. And I'm surprised that didn't show up in your.
So I think that's right. So one good question here that's sort of implicit there is, what about the query editors that already come with databases? Why not just put one of those online? And there's a few answers to this. One, the ones that are already implemented are pretty simple. Being able to describe in English what your query is doing and save that with the query is nice. Actually, before you even do that, saving the query, right? You can say create view, name, and so forth. We find that to be pretty heavyweight and that people get a little bit stuck on that. So we've kind of hidden that from them. It is automatically creating views behind the scenes, but we've sort of streamlined that process. So that's one little thing. The other thing is you can describe it with some metadata. Beyond that, though, all the collaborative query stuff, right, where you can share it and permissions and favorite it and make comments on it and so forth, is something we're interested in exploring. Does that make sense? So I think a query editor like that is a great start, but there's these other features we find seem to have a lot of payoff if you implement them. And we're not sure yet. Maybe it'll be useless and all we need is a query editor, but I mean, they existed for a long, sorry, one more thing. They existed for a long time, and yet there wasn't uptake. And so we kind of think there must be something more we need, and we're trying to figure out what that is. Sorry,
Okay, great. So I'm just trying to understand the business model behind this. I mean, I can't upload 16 terabytes of data, right?
That's right.
What are the limits?
Right now, the limits are so one limit is SQL Azure has a 50 gigabyte limit. That's one limit. You're going to run into other limits even if you could upload more because it's only a single site SQL Server database. But that's where we're really targeting this long tail, where the scale is not the main problem. The heterogeneity and the sort of number of files is the main problem. I would like to see a sort of fully scalable system out there, and there's definitely some people working on that sort of thing, but that hasn't been our focus yet.
Hi. In terms of your bootstrapping the scientist, your 4 steps or whatever, I'm interested in some comments you might have about the level of effort that's required to upload the data.
Right.
How successful you've been in, how many ever cases you've taken on.
Yeah, it hasn't been so hard yet, but absolutely, there's a lot of heterogeneous file formats out there, and if we were in the business of having to write parsers for every single one of those, that would be a problem. We know how to read FASTA. We read a lot of CSV. People export from Excel. We can tap into Excel if we need to, although inside Excel things aren't always just rows and columns as you can imagine. There's an interesting area of research there that we haven't quite explored yet. And again, I mentioned Kathleen Fisher's work. I think that's very relevant here. She can, with this pad system, it's pretty awesome. You can give it examples of an ASCII file format, and it will learn the structure of it over time and automatically parse it and error check it and do all kinds of great things. And so we want to sort of tap into some of those ideas here as well.
Hi, Joe Futrell from NCSA. I'm a semantic web guy, and I don't want to start a religious war here because I don't think we have to. They meet different niches. Well, I've been interested in interoperability of scientific data sets, and one of the things that bothers me about Excel and relational databases is the lack of any kind of global namespace control. And so you see that as soon as you try to scale out to a multidisciplinary team, you get problems. We like SQL for a lot of reasons. It's set-based. It has at least some notion of some entity, which maybe is associated with a row. But I just want to observe that some of the claims you're making for SQL are exactly the same claims that you hear semantic web people making for the semantic web, that it's sort of representational neutral modeling of your information. And you said something that SQL solves the problem that when your data changes, your application doesn't break. But we've observed that applications do break when SQL schemas change. And that's because a database query, SQL query is not an application any more than a Sparkle query is an application. So the application layers on top of these databases tend to be very closely bound to the databases. And that's because the database can't do everything the scientist needs to do. So how would you comment on how you build on top of an ecosystem like this that can upgrade your data to SQL and then run a real application?
So it's clear to me that you're not using views in that application you're talking about. The solution there is logical data independence. And so when I write an application against a set of tables, and then I need to rechange my schema under the sheets, I do 2 things. I change the schema under the sheets, but I also make sure I recreate the view to protect that application from the changes I just made. That's how relational databases were intended to be used, and that's how no one uses them.
Right.
Well, it exists, though. The technology works.
Thank you again. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, all right. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. You mentioned you're looking at collaborative features and favoriting and so on, but interestingly, we've come at a similar place from another side, and this relates to Joe's comment as well. On the My Experiment site, people share workflows, and they have the favoriting and the collaborative features. What we're observing is that they're increasingly sharing Sparkle queries. So this supports what you're proposing, but reinforces what Joe just said as well. That perhaps we should be looking at Sparkle as well.
No, I think that's fine. So Sparkle is isomorphic to SQL over a generic simplified schema with 3 columns, right? The problem is that the size of your query takes the brunt of that, right? So if you have a small schema, you have a large query necessarily. And so for the same to get the same result, you end up having a sort of 3-page Sparkle query, which is a 3-line SQL query in some cases. And that's why I sort of prefer SQL overall. I think it's easier to write an SQL statement than the equivalent Sparkle query.
I suppose it comes down to why people want to share these things. If they're complicated to build,
true. That's true.
Okay, let's move on. So our next presenter is Dr. João Meidanis from University of Campinas, Brazil.
So I'm João Meidanis. I'm here to talk about SinBiota 2.0, planning a new generation environmental information system. And I'm actually representing Professor Carlos Joly, who's the PI in this project and couldn't make it here, so I'm here on his behalf. All right, so let me put some background on the talk. We are from the state of São Paulo, which is a state in Brazil, around that region up there, and it's a very pretty developed state. It's the best developed state in the country, close to some Western European countries in terms of development. It's 22% of Brazilians' population, 33% of Brazilians' GDP, Brazil's GDP. The per capita income's quite high for countries of the same standard. Produces 42% of Brazilian exports, and it's the biggest sugar cane producer also in the country. Well, all this development comes at a cost. So the vegetation left in this last 500 years since Brazil was discovered, this is what's left in the state of São Paulo, more or less. So have to do something about it. So in 1999, a group of researchers from the state, they got together with the research funding agency, the main research funding agency of the state, and created this Biota program in compliance with the Convention for Biological Diversity. And the goal of the program was to map the biodiversity of the state. So lots of projects, people will go around and look for species, animals, plants, all life forms, and collect observations and material for that. Recently, so this is more than 10 years now going on, there's a recent science article reviewing the project. You can take a look. As a byproduct of the project, at the beginning of the project, they created a new journal called Biota Neotropica, devoted to publishing original research about, the life forms in neotropical regions. Papers here not necessarily linked to the program, but about neotropical regions, biotropical life forms in general. And another byproduct of this program was that at some point state legislators paid attention to what was being done and are using the information to provide, for instance, guidelines for biodiversity conservation, restoration in the state of São Paulo, and also to prohibit sugarcane expansion into areas that are most endangered. So these red areas that you see there, and they selected the areas based on research done within the program. So it's a very interesting case where you see actually science influencing the government, political decisions. All right, and then to store all the information collected over the several projects that comprise the program, at some point they built a system called SinBiota to record all the observations, all the species, and all the collections, all the observations, all the gatherings have to have a GPS coordinates. That's mandatory in the program. So they have the positions, their geographical position can map that into the map of the state. Here we have some sample of a number of records and species of some selected taxonomic groups of importance. There is a map system also with within the system, so you can do several things like select a region and then focus on this region, make a zoom, or several operations. I'm not going too much into that, just to give you an idea of what the system does right now. However, the system served its purpose. It was very valuable, but now the time has come to look at the system, and it has some shortcomings, and you need to evolve. So here are some of the shortcomings that researchers have observed. It's hard to expand with new modules, not easily portable. If you want to replicate that to other regions, it's also difficult. All these three reasons, basically because there's very few documentation. It was written like you build a house and then you put a little room here and there, piecewise work. There is no checking for the geographic coordinates. Whatever you decide to put there, it accepts. So some of the observations are in the middle of the Atlantic and things like that. I have to correct that. And spelling of species names also, there's some degree of misspelling there. So okay, we need to upgrade, we need to improve, we need to evolve the system. How do we go about it? Well, the Research Foundation commissioned TI specialists from the state, recruited them among the top universities in the state, and asked them to come up with a plan, and that's what they said should be done. Okay, so first you have to write a reference document, which is a specification for the new system. Then make a public call for implementation groups, because that's always a problem. Who's going to implement that? So make a public call, and then implement the thing, possibly one module at a time. The current system was implemented via a grant to a group within the project, but they didn't have a reference document. They delivered the system, but documentation was very scarce. All right, okay. Apart from that, there was a community meeting in 2009, last year, where everyone involved in the project, or in several projects that comprise the program, more than 300 researchers and students got together for 2 full days and discussed what they want in the next 10 years, just to put a time frame towards the future. And these guys got together and drafted a document which is called Science Plan and Strategies for the Next Decade. And this document, it's part of the science paper as supplementary material if you want to download it. I know this is being taped, so you can follow the links and stuff if you want to download it's a 60-page document. But okay, so the researchers said something about the system, the various aspects of the program, and in particular of the system also. So some requirements that the community came up with. Of course, you want to import all the data from the current system. You have to have a system that it can be easily replicable and portable to use in other places, other states, or in the whole country, or in other countries. Must be easily expandable, if you want to include new modules in the future. Other than that, it would be good to have a built-in dictionary with species names to avoid mistakes of misspelling. The scientific names are always in Latin and stuff, so you never know it's double L or Y or, So it's good to have a standard. Also, a mechanism for checking the coordinates. Make sure, it's just this thing will be just a suggestion. Okay, someone puts I saw, a lion in the middle of the Atlantic. So, are you sure? Something like that. Of course, the researcher is the final word. and import-export mechanisms to communicate with other specialized tools that do all kinds of analysis on this biodiversity data. This is also needed. And this is a sample of the tools we were talking about. So there's tools for climate analysis, metabolomics, distribution of species, and also DNA barcoding. DNA barcoding was something that the community very strongly emphasized that should be considered. What's the barcode? Well, essentially, as I understand it, I'm not a biologist, but it's something like a DNA test you do on the animal, and then it's like the DNA test you have for identifying humans, you would have to identify whole species. So you take DNA of something, then match with some kind of table, and then you know which species this animal or plant belongs to. So the system should be somehow aware of the barcoding and things like that. All right. Another thing that they asked for is to expand the cartographic base because, the state of Sao Paulo, the borders are defined politically, but if you're studying a certain species or a forest or a life form, doesn't care about political frontiers. So naturally, you're studying something that goes across the political frontier. So you want to expand the cartographic base to the other regions of Brazil, and also to the sea, because many people study sea creatures. So that's another request. And the final one is full interoperability with similar systems that these researchers are using all over the world. We have here the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is a facility that many people use, other networks, databases, and other initiatives in the state of Sao Paulo funded by the same research agency, like the Bioenergy Project, a Global Climate Project. So I guess this is all we have for the community requirements. Okay, so what happened next is that, this research foundation, FAPESP, together with Microsoft Research, that's I think the third or fourth year now, they are funding projects on several areas of interest. And particularly, actually, there is a brochure outside if you are interested in all projects. Other projects also funded by this combination, FAPESP, Microsoft Research. It's in the registration desk, I believe. Last year's call, the Biota program got a grant from this joint foundations. And the goals it's a 2-year project, and the goals are to write this reference document, taking into account all the community requirements and other requirements, and also implement a prototype for the new SinBiota, which we are calling here SinBiota 2.0. And so in the rest of the talk, all this was preparation for the talk, actually. So the talk is going to begin now. We're going to tell you how we're doing, right? It's almost a year since the project started. Okay, so about the reference document, we are studying, we want to study all these topics. More than half of them we already have people looking at it, they're writing reports and stuff. But those are the topics we want to include in the reference document. Visits to user to get feedback, but that's something we have to do. It's not will not necessarily be in the document, but study of the other systems, similar systems around the world, Atlas of Living Australia, Encyclopedia of Life, GBIF that I mentioned, and others. Something about scalability and security of large databases. multimodal data and search. By this I mean the people, it's not in the system right now, but in the future we want to put pictures or sounds and then allow people to search based on that. Like, oh, I'm looking for a bird that's singing more or less like that. Then you do a query with that. It would be wonderful. So how to do that, or are we going to require that in the specification document? Survey of map systems, which map systems you use, which specialized tools we have to intercommunicate with, how to do data mining, knowledge discovery, what the system has to have to allow this more easily. Use of mobile clients, you go to the field, make your observations, and immediately you can send the data to the database with your mobile or PDA or something. Use of cloud computing, will it be necessary? Will people be happy with that, having their data in the cloud? Some people are very restrictive about that, some scientists. And social networks, can they help? Shall we use them, or what? So this is the topics in the reference document. We are studying all these topics. And then for the prototype, I'm going to say a few words of what we are doing. First of all, there is a current system. We didn't have a chance to get the current system yet for some technical reasons, but we got part of it, and one of the parts of the schema, the database schema, and we noticed that we have access to the database as users, so we can log in and do several queries and stuff. And we noticed that the integrity constraints are somewhat relaxed. I mean, you can put things in you shouldn't actually put. We don't know exactly if that's a problem with the database or the system, but it allows you to do things that you shouldn't. There is more redundancy that we think would be appropriate. For instance, you register an observation, then you want to reference a paper. Then when you reference a paper, you have to write all the details of the paper. If you have a second observation and you're going to reference the same paper, you have to enter all the details again. And that creates like several copies of the same paper. And something that strikes us as funny is you see this right side of the schema. There's one table for each taxon rank. So it's domain, kingdom, and order, phylum, and so. And we thought, well, is this the best way to do that? So we thought about it a long time. Okay, so we came up with our own schema, which is not exactly a schema. It's what we think is the modern way of doing something like that. You do a class modeling of the thing, and then use a framework for object relational mapping. So you use object orientation, and then get that map to relational database. There's standard tools to do that. And in this way of looking at things, the taxonomy it's just one class or table, one class, which is a taxon. So if you look at this as a table, so taxon groups are rows in the taxon table. The rank is just an attribute of this thing. And you can have explicit parent-child relationship. In the old scheme, we observed that they didn't have that. Like if you can put a new species or fish, say, and say that this is a son of a genera of plants, the system would not complain. So we decided to do something more strict here. This is more natural for us, I guess. The system architecture, we're also paying a lot of attention to that, because that's the kind of documentation that people will need to evolve the system in the future, the prototype. So for the prototype, we have a well-thought and well-designed system architecture with layers and division classes around each part here. The classes only communicate with some of the other packages. It's something more controlled, and hopefully people will understand. And then for the map part, right now we are using Bing Maps, and these are some of the maps that you can do with the system. The goal of the prototype is to imitate what the current system is doing right now, perhaps with a few additions or some simple additions, but the goal is to imitate what the system is doing right now and to allow it to evolve towards what they really want for SinBiota 2.0. So it's just a few maps that we are able to do right now. You can see that using Bing Maps, automatically the cartographic base is extended to the whole world if you want. So this is one problem solved. Another thing that we are implementing, which is quite common nowadays, is autocomplete feature for species names. Although this is only part of the problem of misspelling of species names, because the way people now introduce data into the system is not by typing, but directly into the web interface. But rather, they download a spreadsheet model where they go home and they fill all the lines with all the rows with data they collected, and then they upload this into the system. So there has to be some checking in the upload phase also. 3 more? Okay, I'm right at the end. Yeah, well, actually that's the end, because now all I have is links that go to everything I talked about during the talk. So there's the current Biota site, the journal site, the system, and other projects. And these 3 things in black here at the end are the sites for the government regulations using the Biota. Of course, it's in Portuguese. Only a few of you will understand. But anyway, I just put that in because I know it's going to be taped and stuff, so you can go back and look at, visit the things. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Questions? So this is the first year with the end of the second year of a 10-year plan. It's a 10-year plan, right?
Yes. This is the 10-year plan for what they want to do, right? And the project with FAPESP and Microsoft is just a 2-year project. So this is the first year of that. We have another year to finish the prototype and to migrate all the data, actually.
So the deployment comes at the end of the second year. Great. With that, let's conclude this session. Thanks again.
Thank you.